Hi, welcome to another episode of Sustainability Shorts. In this episode, we're going to be speaking about mining and its environmental impact and the heavy social responsibility that it carries. In the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution ushered in a heavy reliance on readily available and inexpensive fossil fuels. But before then, dating back to 1,000,000 years ago, most energy was renewable in the form of bioenergy and wind power. As the world awakened to the degradative environmental impact of fossil fuels, as well as their infinite nature, and renewable energy solutions on an industrial level, they became more accessible and efficient. Alternative energy made a strong comeback. The demand for clean energy is accelerating the push to extract essential minerals. And in this scenario, the mining industry plays a crucial role in the transition to a low-carbon economy. But the mining industry has been historically linked to human rights abuses, environmental degradation, and corruption. Now, how does the industry minimize its social and environmental impact while at the same time ensure that it maximizes value per ton of extracted mineral? To speak more on this issue, I turn the spotlight to Marium Khalid. Marium, I'm so glad that you could make it to today's episode. Could you give a brief introduction about yourself and the role that you are playing in the energy transition?
Hi, Nida. Thank you so much for having me on this. It's a pleasure to do this with you, especially at a time when we really kind of can see that minerals and the mining industry has taken a center stage in Pakistan. We just got off a couple of weeks ago from a BRIM certification together, which brought on a lot of people from all over Pakistan, a lot of diverse backgrounds from all over Pakistan. And a lot of these people were absolutely new to the industry and could not really work their mind around the fact that the mining industry is playing such a crucial role. But when I look at the mineral industry, it kind of amazes me, as you said also, that it's had such an important role in the history of, industrialization. When you look at the Bronze Age, you look at commercial activity, any commercial activity that you can think of, the building blocks of that has been the minerals industry. Now, because this is becoming such an important topic all over the world, of course, the question comes to how can we make this industry sustainable? And as a lawyer, for me, the question always is that every commercial activity will leave a carbon footprint, will leave a mark. But really, what is the real test? That is to ensure that we try to use best practices to ensure it's as sustainable as possible. It's as sustainable and responsible at the same time. Because a lot of these industries have long-term, repercussions. You may not see it right now. Our generation may not see it right now, but our future generations will be bearing the impact of it. So coming back to my role, what have I been doing with it? You're already familiar that I started out, my interest in minerals really started out as a student in Australia. I was in a country where, predominant part of their GDP, especially Western Australia, was based on the minerals economy. And a lot of students from South American countries were literally doing their PhDs and masters in minerals law, and I really hadn't heard much about it. So that's where the interest started. And when I returned, it was in my list that I need to find a law firm or I need to find a place that is working in this area. And I just happened to come across a law firm in Islamabad that was working on the RICO-Dig disputes. So I worked on the disputes for a couple of years, and that was an eye-opener when it came to the significance of this case for the Baloch community, but really the lack of capacity. At the time this contract was entered into, from the time the disputes really started, and from the way we could see these arbitrations were kind of panning out. So I spent a few years working on those disputes before I went in-house in the energy sector. And once I was in the energy sector, even though I think the country has kind of taken its time to wake up to this nexus and this collaboration, I could see right then and there that, the renewables industry and the extractives industries are not competing anymore. There is a complementary role that they have now. You need these minerals for clean energy technologies, whether that's solar panels, whether that's your wind turbines, whether that's your lithium-ion batteries. Everything requires these minerals. So really now, I think the question for Pakistan is, how do we position ourselves? Because look, the fact that we haven't been a traditionally mining country has a benefit as well. We have at our disposal a lot of case studies from all over the world, how to avoid certain cases and how to embrace certain practices. So I think we should really look at the positive and kind of position Pakistan in a way where we are benefiting from, the experiences of these countries that have learned from past experiences.
All right, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I think that setting that context is so important in how the two industries, the mining and the energy industries, should be viewed in as complementary to each other. Because essentially there is now, because of this ever so increasing demand for clean energy, that push is there on the mining industry. And my next question sort of does revolve around this subject matter. So according to the International Energy Agency, the demand for clean energy is going to set to rise, and the share of renewable energy in the energy mix is going to increase from 30% in 2023 to 46% in 2030. Yeah. This means that the mining industry needs to mine far more ever than it did in its history in order to meet this demand. However, bridging that demand gap requires overcoming complex project initiation boundaries, with regulations being one of them. So my question to you is, how do we, first of all, where do the bottlenecks lie? Mm-hmm. And how can we strengthen the regulations surrounding environment protection based on your practical understanding as well as your professional experiences?
Okay, so the first part of your question is where you rightly pointed out about how these, the International Energy Agency, the IEA, has come up with a number of reports which are signaling as to a astronomical increase in the demand for these minerals. Just to remember and recall a few instances, I remember seeing that with graphite, indium, cobalt, there is an almost 500 increase for demand projected. That's astronomical. That means that realistically, it's going to be very difficult for countries to really meet that demand. And I honestly fear that this area is going to kind of become an area replete for conflict. Because bear in mind, minerals are non-renewable in nature. Once you extract them from the ground, they're gone. It's not as if you'll have opportunities to do it over and over again. There's also something called responsible mining, in which you want to mine in the correct method, and you want to ensure that you're not compromising on the value of the resource, or you're not compromising the longevity of the project, because a lot of these projects average, they span up to a good 25 to 30 years. That is how long a mining lease can also last for. So coming back to your second question, that where do the bottlenecks lie? As you correctly pointed out, a lot of these environmental standards are, at the most, principles. They're not being enshrined in your law, or if they are, the implementation is very weak. So Pakistan does not have a lot of mining specific regulations. There are some laws which were, I believe, quite old, and there's been recent effort made by the Ministry of Energy Petroleum Division to harmonize a lot of these laws to ensure that you have a clear document which kind of signals to the investor as well that these are the checklists that they have to follow, and there's a more comprehensive and clear idea of what they have to comply with. But I still feel there's a lot more that needs to be done. And as we were just talking about that, one example comes to my mind. I remember in the 80s and the 90s, there was a lot of issue with African countries with respect to blood diamonds. There was a lot of trade going on with these conflict diamonds, which involved an excessive amount of human rights abuse, and these countries kind of got together and came out with a joint Kimberley process, which is an international certification now in which they ask countries to be a part of, and then these countries all try together to ensure that the supply chain for at least diamonds is safe from these practices. So I've been thinking, and if that is something that we can kind of implement for Pakistan as well, because bear in mind, Pakistan still is a new country when it comes to large-scale mining. Artisanal mining, we've had a lot of that going on in Pakistan. But we also need to have clarity with these laws with respect to local communities, because I really think it's your local communities who are the custodian of these projects. They are the only permanent feature, in a country like Pakistan, where your governments will change in a few years, where politicians will come and go, but the communities are there to stay. So I really think one thing that needs to happen is to have these laws that we have translated into local regional languages so that our local communities have access to them, and then let them ensure that these projects go forward. Let them also keep a check on the investors, because once an investor comes into a country, we have a tendency of either being too nationalistic or being overtly investor friendly. This was also work in progress. I think for a country like Pakistan that's still trying to come into its own with the minerals industry, that we need to find that right balance where we are making the best use of our mineral resources, but we're not doing it at the expense of our local communities. But at the same time, we are not being detrimental to the rights and interests of the investors who've invested a lot of money and capital into these projects.
Coming back to the impact of the mining industry on the local environment as well as biodiversity, now there does seem to exist laws which protect the environment, and some of which fall under the regions where these mining companies do operate in. And there you have the existence, as I mentioned earlier, which sort of guide environmental conservation activities. Yet, time and again, we see mining companies, even you have those big mining companies such as Barrick and so forth. They still encroach local ecosystems and are degrading the natural environment. I want to ask you, why is this happening, and how can we mine better?
Nida, your question actually made me think of an occurrence that happened, I think, about 2 years ago. And Rio Tinto, which is one of the mining giants, a global mining giant, in one of their mining projects, they actually ended up destroying a 46,000-year cave which belonged to the local Aboriginal communities. Now, this obviously turned into a huge uproar because the local communities and people were like, it's not possible for Rio Tinto to not have known. Because when these mining companies start their exploration and mining activities, there's a whole environmental assessment that's taken place. They are completely aware of the geography of the area, of the topography of the area, of the water resources in the area. So these are decisions that are taken with a lot of, understanding, data, and expertise. But irrespective of that, there are still things that go wrong. And I think it really will come down to how active your local communities are, because Australia is one of those countries where the local communities feel very, very strongly about their environment. And the laws are very, very strong as well, and so is their implementation. Pakistan, on the other hand, unfortunately, does not have the same relationship with environment, I would say. We do have some incredible think tanks and some incredible activists who are working in the environment space, but really the onus has to shift on the government, on regulators, in the same way, as I said, that there needs to be a regulatory body which is actively monitoring the activities of the investors. I'm also thinking that all over the world, a lot of developing countries are in the process of updating their mining codes and their mining regimes, because bear in mind, the capacity has increased, the awareness has increased. A lot of countries understand now the economics that can trickle down from these, from these minerals. But they also realize that they may not have entered into the best deals. But the best way to kind of ensure that you're not entering into a legal dispute, because you can't really take away, mineral rights midway, that's also an issue, and that can lead you into international disputes. But what is a better way to do this is that when you're updating your mining codes, you kind of need to take stakeholders, including your investor companies, on board. And the good ones, I believe, would really understand what the country is trying to do. I'll just think of an example recently with Marium Gold, and incredible mining company again, but it recently went into a bit of a deadlock with the Mali government. I believe the issue stemmed from their updating of their mining code, in which they were trying to retain more state ownership, have better royalties, have better rights for the local communities. But I think that didn't go down well, and perhaps the SEC company was having a difficult time accepting that because it was in the middle of their ongoing project. But I think if you look at the broader picture, I think host countries need to be given that room, because there is a UN principle on sovereignty over your permanent sovereignty over your natural resources. It really is up to the countries to kind of decide on how they want to dispose of their resources. But the problem really happens when they've entered into these contracts, which are, of course, as I said, 25, 30 years into, 25, 30 years of a lifespan. But I think this is where good lawyers will step in and good policymakers will step in. They will always try to build in cushions in these contracts, which will allow these local host, governments to update their mining codes as they see fit without entering into expropriatory behavior.
Yeah, so I think this is a very important set of points that you bring forward, and that is that the host country needs to step up and sort of create that framework, first of all, and strengthen it. And that framework should not only, it should encompass or address a whole spectrum of issues, and one of them being the environment. I mean, you do have environmental protection agencies even existing in these countries, but they're so much so effective until they're supported by the state. So my next question is circulates around the diversity and inclusivity, the degree rather of that in the industry. So the mining industry is associated with lack of diversity and inclusivity. And before I jump into my question, I'd like to start off with a quote from Elizabeth Broderick. So she is the special rapporteur and an independent expert for the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls. If we don't actively and intentionally include women, the system will unintentionally exclude them. The reason for this is that the systems in the mining industry were invented by men, for men, and today largely run by men. Forcing women into systems and cultures designed for men isn't an effective strategy to build greater levels of diversity and inclusion. The solution lies in shifting the power rather than fixing the women. What can we do individually and collectively to improve the representation of women in the industry? And I'd like you to take this opportunity to perhaps elaborate more on the initiative that you have recently taken in this context.
Thank you for that. Nida, I'll be very honest. I don't think right now it's only a gender issue in the mining industry. And, as we've spoken about this before, when we started, when I started recruiting women for the BRIM course, I discovered it wasn't just a gender issue, it was also a discipline issue in the sense that normally, the energy sector and the mining industry were dominated by engineers or people holding technical portfolios. This is something that we try to break with Women in Energy, because when we started our own, network, we really wanted to focus on the interdisciplinary nature of the industry. You need more lawyers in the conversation. You need more people with finance backgrounds in the conversation. You need geologists. You need, people who just don't have technical backgrounds. And that was so important to see in the minerals industry. And I think you can testify to the benefits that we're all now kind of, seeing, because now we have access to an entire cohort with any and every background imaginable. And that is what makes a conversation rich. When we're looking at mining contracts, we're not going to be only looking at lawyers. We're going to need your commercials team. We'll need your business team. We'll need these teams on board. And it's so important for us to start building that expertise now, because as a disputes lawyer, as a former disputes lawyer rather, a lot of issues stem from lack of understanding and a lack of capacity. And this is a problem that we associate with Pakistan so much, yet there's so little that we're doing on a continuous basis, right? Because we also have to understand a lot of these industries, I can speak for energy and mining, for instance, are long-term industries. You cannot take a decision overnight and expect a result in a week's time or a month's time or a year's time. The results take years in the making. Similarly, if you're taking bad decisions, it would take years to reverse the impact of that. So I think when we speak of diversity, even though we started off as a group that wanted to promote visibility of women and kind of provide leadership and mentorship, and because you wanted me to announce this as well, Nida and I are co-founding Women in Mining together. That's something we feel very passionate about, and we cannot wait to share more details on that. But really the diversity is also in terms of the professional backgrounds. I think that is the need of the hour, and we're so fortunate that we were able to do that with BRAIM and kind of build this community where we have access to everybody. So we know if there's a geology-related issue, we know who to turn to. We know if there's a finance-related issue, who to turn to. We know if there's a policy matter, who do we turn to. And I think this has been the beauty. And this is what Pakistan needs right now. It really needs to build its homegrown capacity because, that is the only way you'll make better contracts. That's the only way you make better deals. And at the end of the day, your reputation as a responsible country will only, enhance if you're honoring your commitments. So as a lawyer, I will never advise walking away from a bad deal because that's really not the investor's fault. But the investor at the end of the day is an investor. Their interest is their own company, or their own revenue generation. They will have CSR activities for you. But, it's really the host country's responsibility to ensure that when it's negotiating these deals, there's not much cross disparity. Like historically, if your investor is here, like your developing countries are here when you negotiate contracts, this gap needs to be bridged. That's what needs to happen.
Absolutely. And I think that's also another important point that you've brought forward, and which is that as a host country, first of all, and we speak from a developing country's perspective, and that perspective is extremely important. I mean, considering the disparity issue that you just brought up, we need to be smart about which investor we bring in. And for that, we need to wear the lens of that investor, essentially speaking. And why that diversity, as you speak, is so important is because someone from a finance background will be better positioned to understand the language of the investor. And then you have the backed by your lawyers who ensure that your rights are not abused. You have your environmental professionals who ensure that the rights of the local environment and the community are safeguarded. So everyone has a part to play, and it'll only happen if we drop down those walls and sort of hold hands and take this forward together. Coming to the end of our podcast, looking forward, what hope do you have for the industry? And secondly, how do you see the future of the mining? And do you think that the current events sort of now inhibiting energy transition?
Nida, I think one thing is very clear, that the minerals space is a national narrative now. It's a foreign policy matter for many countries of the world. And it needs to be one for Pakistan. Every country when approaching minerals are looking at the next 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years. So I think if I have to give an advice that what should we do, how should we address this better, I think we need to prioritize this area for our future generations. We need to kind of equip ourselves, build our training schools, make sure our mining schools have these interdisciplinary, curriculum, which is really raising the next generation, and kind of ensure that Pakistan gets it right. Pakistan's not the only country in the world that has suddenly realized that it possesses like $6 trillion of mineral wealth. It's one of the many. What it does with it is really what's going to define our next century. Pakistan kind of needs to ensure that it's learning these lessons, making sure that it gets its policies right, and policies with a long-term lens. You cannot wake up one day and say, I'm going to, finish this off, I'm going to change this. That's also not fair to the investor, and that does not signal, a good, responsible nation. At the heart of it should be your local communities. Your local communities should be at the forefront of every decision you're making.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm going to be taking away for my audience is that as professionals, we really need to break the silos and sort of become interdisciplinary, as you put it. And we talked at great length throughout this podcast about how that is and how we try to achieve that with BRIM. Yeah. And secondly, because minerals are going to be and are affecting our everyday lives and are going to be and so many foreign policies are going to be affected by it, we need to ensure that the economic benefits, especially as developing countries, trickle down to the rightful owners, which are the local communities. And we need to put them at the forefront. And for that, as we said, that we need to have a framework, a national framework, and a very strong set of regulations which essentially put the people first and serve our national interests. Yeah. Thank you, Marium, for having. Thank you.
Thank you.
With this, we conclude our third episode. Stay tuned. And in the next episode, we're going to be speaking more about the solarization in Pakistan.